Hello, my dear friends. Some women in World War I had to change their sanitary napkins in the middle of hospital corridors, use urine to wash their underwear, and apply gasoline to their private parts to disinfect. This is not an exaggeration, but a dirty reality that would make many people today feel horrified. But for them, it was a matter of survival, a habit, a part of an unrecognised service. Behind the white coats of nurses were scratched bodies, unclean, not fragrant, but extremely brave. Tonight, we enter the foulest corners of war no one dared to mention. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think a modern period is uncomfortable with pads, heating blankets, and ibuprofen, imagine bleeding into a piece of old curtain cloth and rinsing it behind a wounded soldier's bed. That was how many women managed menstruation during World War I. There were no disposable pads, no private bathrooms, and no time to complain, whether they were nurses in military hospitals, workers in munitions factories, or villagers cut off from supply lines. They all had to improvise with whatever materials they had. Hygiene became something you pieced together, one rag at a time. Most women reused cloth rags. These weren't clean strips carefully folded in a linen closet. They were often torn from old dresses, aprons, or even curtain linings. If something was absorbent, it could work. There were no wings, no adhesives, and no elastic. Women tied the cloth into place using belts, strings, or by layering it between undergarments. It wasn't secure, but it was better than nothing. Many learned to walk carefully, never rushing, in case the cloth slipped or bunched. Accidents happened. There was no shame in it, just frustration. Washing the clothes was even more difficult. Clean water was rare. In hospitals, it was reserved for wounds, not women's needs. So women used whatever they could find. Sometimes it was water left over from sponge bathing soldiers. Sometimes it was a metal basin set aside in the corner of a tent. One nurse recalled rinsing her menstrual cloth in the same water she used to clean muddy boots. That image alone is enough to make anyone reconsider the word multitasking. There was no detergent. Soap, if available, was rationed. Cloths were scrubbed with salt or ash, hung to dry behind crates, or tucked behind headboards if there was a risk of someone stealing or mocking them. Privacy did not exist. In overcrowded aid stations or war-ravaged homes, women shared sleeping areas, eating areas, and wash areas. Some would wrap their used rags in newspaper to hide the stains before sneaking them away to rinse. Others folded them into small squares and pressed them under the mattress of a dying man, waiting for a moment alone to deal with it. The mattress would smell, but so would everything else. Blood, sweat, dirt, and disinfectant mingled into the scent of survival. No one complained. No one had time to. Not everyone had cloth. Some women, especially refugees and peasants, used what the land offered. Rags became rare when people stopped donating fabric or when blankets were reserved for the injured. In those moments, women used dried leaves, moss, even hay. Moss was preferred when it could be gathered clean. It was soft and naturally absorbent. But when picked from damp forest floors, it often came with bugs or mould. Still, it was better than bleeding down the legs with nothing at all. In trench-adjacent zones, paper was the next option. Old letters, newspapers, and even military reports were shredded and folded. The paper soaked up blood quickly, but it disintegrated under pressure. It tore, crumbled, and left fragments behind. Women often layered several sheets together and hoped for the best. Some fashioned a pouch out of fabric scraps and stuffed it with paper or moss. This allowed for the removal of the stuffing and the reuse of the pouch. It was not sanitary, but it was manageable. It's almost funny how people today complain when a period cup leaks a drop, while women back then hoped their makeshift pad wouldn't fall out during an air raid. They didn't have apps to track cycles. Many didn't even remember the day. Time blurred when alarms, gunfire, and shifts dictated life. They marked the start of their period by the feel of warmth between the thighs or the sight of red on their underclothes. Then they acted. They folded. They tied. They hoped. These clothes weren't just uncomfortable. They were dangerous. Reuse without proper sterilisation led to infections. Women developed rashes, sores, and even sepsis. Boiling cloths helped, but not everyone had access to fire or clean pots. Some tried soaking them in vinegar or salt water. Others sprinkled ash on them to dry out the odour. In war zones, bad smells were everywhere. But there was still embarrassment in smelling like blood. Women who worked in close quarters with male staff tried to sit apart, hoping no one would notice. Every night, these women checked their supplies. They didn't count tampons or pads. They counted scraps. They evaluated each one for dryness, thickness, and whether it could last another day. Some clothes were reused until they shredded at the edges. When that happened, women stitched them with whatever thread they had. Medical thread, shoelaces, wire, anything that would hold the fabric together and keep it from slipping. They stored their clothes in empty biscuit tins or between pages of unused notebooks. Menstruation was rarely discussed. It was seen as a nuisance, a distraction from duty, something to deal with in silence. Many women learned to fold their clothes in the dark, change them while half asleep, or swap them behind doors while guarding the entrance themselves. In moments like these, I see not just the creativity but the sheer discipline of these women. There was no dignity in the process, but there was pride in managing it. Mothers taught their daughters to prepare for their period not with products, but with systems. A clean rag, a tin to store it, a place to dry it, and a method to fold it securely. Those were the basics. Girls as young as 12 learned this routine. They weren't given lectures about biology or self-care. They were shown where to find cloth and told not to lose it. That was enough. In some areas, communal cloths were even rumoured to exist, passed between women in a shelter or a camp. They were used in turns, washed when possible, and passed on again. Whether that was true or not, the idea alone says something about the desperation. They weren't trying to be clean. They were trying not to rot. They were trying not to stink, not to bleed openly, not to become unwell. Nothing about it was modern. Nothing about it was hygienic. But it was all they had. Some women continued to use cloth rags even after the war ended. They were used to it, and commercial options were too expensive. Their daughters would inherit the habit, folding new rags from old dresses. The war changed everything, but it didn't erase how resourcefulness became a substitute for comfort. The idea that a woman could manage her period with moss and newspaper while treating wounded soldiers shows a level of endurance most of us can't imagine. It wasn't about shame, it was about control. When everything else fell apart, a folded rag tucked in place gave them the feeling of doing something right. The war was not kind to their bodies, but they kept moving. Tomorrow, we'll talk about how these same women managed to bathe with no access to hot water, no private space, and no clean soap. You might never look at your bathroom the same way again. If cleaning a blood-soaked cloth behind a dying soldier was already difficult, trying to wash your whole body was nearly impossible. For many women during World War I, bathing simply didn't happen. Not because they didn't want to, but because there was nowhere to do it. There were no bathrooms in the tents, no showers behind the barracks, no tubs waiting at the end of a long day. Women lived in shared quarters, makeshift shelters, and overfilled hospitals where privacy didn't exist, and water was saved for more urgent needs. Most of them went days, even weeks, without a proper wash. They wiped their faces in the morning with a damp cloth, and that was often the best they could manage. The cloth was usually rinsed in a small basin sitting near the stove or under a bed. It wasn't refreshed often. Everyone used it. The water turned grey quickly, but it didn't matter. They dipped into it anyway. One cloth, one face, and then another. No one asked where the water came from. They already knew. Full-body baths were rare. When they did happen, they weren't what we think of as relaxing. A bath meant stripping down in a cold room, standing beside a tin tub half filled with reused water, and trying to wipe off the worst parts of yourself before someone else came in. The first woman had the cleanest water. The second had to decide how much dirt she could tolerate. The third didn't have a choice. By the time it was your turn, the water was already a murky soup of other people's effort. There was no luxury in the act, no hot steam, no time, just cold hands, wet rags, and the need to finish quickly. Many women skipped the bath entirely and focused on sections instead. Armpits, neck, and behind the knees, one part at a time. The towel stayed on most of the body. Clothes weren't removed unless absolutely necessary. It wasn't about modesty. It was about keeping warm, staying fast, and avoiding awkward glances in cramped spaces. For the women who worked in field hospitals, the idea of personal hygiene barely made it into their schedule. They changed wound dressings, disposed of amputated limbs, boiled instruments, and held men's hands while they died. At the end of the day, their uniforms smelled like blood and antiseptic. There was no locker room to retreat to, no hot shower waiting. They pulled off their gloves, wiped their hands with whatever was nearby, and sat down to sleep. They didn't even bother changing their socks. Water was treated like medicine. You didn't waste it. You didn't ask for it unless you were bleeding or infected. Boiling water for bathing was seen as indulgent. Heating water took fuel, and fuel was meant for food or keeping the injured alive. If a woman wanted warm water for herself, she had to save what she could from boiling potatoes or cleaning utensils. Some did. Most didn't. We complain now if the hot water runs out in the morning, but these women bathed with water that smelled like cabbage and soap mixed together. They didn't think of it as strange. They thought of it as efficient. Water couldn't be poured down the drain. It had to serve more than one purpose. If it started clean, it could be used for rinsing, then for scrubbing, then for mopping, and finally, if needed, for wiping your feet, in shared shelters. Bathing meant finding a moment when no one else was looking. Women hung up sheets or stood behind coats hung on a string. Someone kept watch. Someone stood guard. If you were lucky, you got 10 minutes to clean yourself. If not, you moved faster. No one stared. No one asked questions. There was a quiet understanding that everyone was equally filthy. In some cases, there wasn't even a basin. Women washed themselves with leftover tea, rainwater collected in pots, or cold broth left from soup. The goal wasn't to feel clean. It was to stop the itching. Armpits burned. Skin between the thighs grew tender. If you could wipe those areas once a day, it would help avoid the worst of the rashes. That was enough. The clothes didn't help. They were thick, hard to remove, and rarely cleaned. Undershirts clung to sweat for days. Socks turned stiff. Bras and undergarments soaked up body odour, but there was nowhere to dry them once washed, so they weren't washed. They were aired out, beaten with a stick, or held over the fire and turned inside out. The more I read about these women, the more I realised that cleanliness was not about comfort. It was about function. If they could move, work, and avoid skin infection, then it counted. Beauty wasn't part of the equation. Clean skin was not a sign of grace. It was a miracle of circumstance. Some women never bathed during their entire service. Not once. They cleaned their hands and faces and nothing more. When the war ended, their skin had changed colour from grime and sun. Their hair smelled like the rooms they lived in, and their bodies were marked by rashes they couldn't name. No one kept a record of these routines. There were no bath logs, no hygiene reports, just stories, passed quietly between nurses, mothers, and factory girls. Stories about the time someone used a bowl of dishwater to rinse her feet, or the night when 3 women shared a single towel, folded it into thirds, and each claimed a corner. It sounds absurd now, but bathing became an act of bravery, not for what it gave, but for what it risked. Time, privacy, reputation, warmth. To undress was to expose. To bathe was to be vulnerable, and many chose to wait. Still, they found ways. Rain was precious. When it came, women stood outside with metal pots, waiting. They caught what they could, carried it back inside, and used it sparingly. Some boiled it. Most didn't. It was cleaner than anything else. It felt like something that hadn't already passed through someone else's hands. The water never lasted long, but the habit of trying remained. They wiped their faces, their hands, the backs of their necks. Then they folded the cloth, set it near the stove, and waited for the next moment they could try again. Tomorrow, we'll turn our attention to their hair, how they combed with fingers, fought lice with vinegar, and sometimes cut everything off just to get some sleep. Even when there was no water to bathe, no soap to wash, and no time to rest, their hair still kept growing. For many women during World War I, hair became one of the most frustrating parts of daily life. Not because it was long or thick or difficult to manage, but because they had no tools to manage it at all. Combs were not handed out. They weren't part of medical kits. They weren't sent in care packages. They weren't considered essential. So women used what they had: fingers, fingernails, and sometimes scissors. At first, they tried to keep up appearances. A quick braid, a simple bun, something tight to keep the strands in place while they worked. But as the weeks passed and the dirt collected, everything became harder. Their scalps itched. Their hair clumped at the ends. Oil built up at the roots. They couldn't rinse it out. They couldn't scrub it clean. They just kept pulling it back and hoping it would stay there. The lack of combs made a simple task nearly impossible. Without a comb, even brushing out tangles turned into a slow, painful job. They ran their fingers through their hair one section at a time. If it caught on a knot, they yanked gently at first. When that didn't work, they pulled harder. Sometimes, the hair came out in small handfuls. Other times, it just stuck. They didn't have the patience to be delicate. One woman said she spent more time trying to detangle her braid than she did preparing a full dinner for 8 wounded men. And even when the knots were out, the hair wasn't clean. It still smelled. It still clung to itself. It still left greasy streaks on the back of her uniform. Cutting the hair wasn't always a choice, but it was a common solution. Women shared scissors if they had them. If not, they used sewing shears, knives, or anything sharp enough to cut through thick strands. The cuts were uneven. No one cared. A jagged edge was better than a nest of knots. They didn't look in mirrors. They just grabbed a handful, held it out, and snipped. Some tried to preserve their hair as long as they could. They tied scarves around their heads. They twisted their hair into low buns and pinned them tight. But pins rusted. Scarves frayed. Eventually the hair fell loose, stuck to the back of their necks, and refused to stay put. The sweat made it stick. The dust turned it gritty. They wiped their foreheads and found strands of hair stuck to their palms. Today, we complain when our brush goes missing. Back then, they didn't even remember what brushing felt like. The idea of soft, clean hair was gone. Their expectations had changed. Neatness was measured by whether or not the lice were visible. If the itching was bearable, it meant the day was going well. Lice were a constant. They lived in the seams of clothing, in the blankets, and deep in the hair. Women learned to live with them. Every scalp itched. Every woman scratched. Some scratched until their skin broke. The tiny bites became red patches. The red patches turned into scabs. They couldn't stop. The feeling was too intense. Delousing became part of the routine, not because it worked, but because it helped for a few hours. Women picked lice out of their hair one by one. They crushed them between their nails or flicked them into the fire. It was tedious. It was disgusting. But there was no other option. Some poured vinegar onto their scalp. hoping it would loosen the eggs. Others tried kerosene, knowing it burned, but desperate to feel relief. They didn't talk much during the process. Delousing wasn't something you bragged about. It was done in silence, sitting near the edge of a cot or leaning against a wall. One woman picked while the other sat still. Then they switched. Sometimes they didn't switch at all. One woman did all the work while the other just stared at the floor. There's something strangely intimate about watching someone dig lice out of your hair while you pretend it doesn't bother you. It didn't feel shameful. It felt necessary. Everyone had the same problem. No one was immune. Rank didn't matter. Uniform didn't matter. If you had hair, you had lice. Eventually, some women shaved their heads, not to make a statement. Not because they wanted to, but because it was easier. No hair meant no tangles, no hiding places for lice, no more pulling, no more tearing. Just a smooth scalp that could be wiped clean with a cloth. Some cried when the hair came off, most didn't. They just folded the scarf they had worn on their head and tucked it away. Shaving was usually done in pairs. One woman held the mirror, if there was one. The other cut, if razors were scarce. They used knives or even broken glass. It wasn't safe. The skin often bled, but it was better than scratching all night and still waking up infested. To me, this part of the war seems the hardest to explain. The invisible discomfort, the itching that never ended, the slow erosion of something once taken for granted. It wasn't about vanity, it was about control. When they cut their hair, they weren't giving up. They were regaining something. After the cut, some wore caps. Others went bare. The cool air felt strange at first. Then it felt freeing. Showers weren't coming back. Clean towels were still a dream. But without hair, they could think about other things. They could sleep longer, work faster, scratch less. Still, lice didn't care. They moved to eyebrows, to clothing, to bed sheets. The fight never ended. But at least the worst part was gone. At least the hair wasn't part of the problem anymore. For those who kept their hair, the work continued. Finger combing, dusting, tying, retying. The knots grew again, the lice came back, and they started all over. In the next part, we'll talk about what women wore under their uniforms and how washing underwear with ash or salt became the only way to stay somewhat clean. When it wasn't possible, they simply wore the same set until it fell apart. Once the hair was dealt with, there was still the matter of clothing. No matter how hard women worked, how carefully they wiped themselves down, or how long they went without a proper bath, nothing stayed clean for long, especially not underwear. These were the garments closest to their skin, worn day and night, and soaked with sweat, blood, and everything else their bodies endured. Washing them wasn't a question of luxury. It was a question of how far you were willing to go with what you had. Soap was rare, if it existed at all. It was saved for wounds or rationed out for communal use. Women couldn't waste it on themselves, and certainly not on something as private as undergarments. They improvised. Ash from the fire became the first solution. It was rubbed into fabric to absorb grease and odour. The ash clung to the fibres, darkening the cloth even as it scraped away some of the filth. The rinse water turned black almost immediately. That didn't stop anyone. Some women added sand to the ash, hoping the grit would help scrub out the stains. Others soaked garments in hot water first. If they could find a pot big enough and fire to heat it, more often than not, they used cold water straight from a bucket or basin. There was no real lather, just rubbing, dipping, wringing, and repeating until their fingers went numb. When ash wasn't available, some women turned to a method older than anyone wanted to admit: diluted urine. It was acidic enough to lift stains, warm enough if used fresh, and always available. They collected it in buckets or pots, sometimes mixing it with water or leftover ashes to increase its effectiveness. The smell was strong. The results were uneven, but it worked better than nothing. There were no gloves, no brushes, just hands. They scrubbed until the cloth no longer felt sticky. Then they wrung it out and hoped the worst of the odour would fade during drying. If not, they wore it anyway. The alternative was to wear something even dirtier. Drying the underwear became another challenge. There were no clotheslines in the trenches, no hooks in hospital tents. Women found creative solutions. Some used the ends of bunk frames, others tied strings between crates or chairs. In outdoor areas, garments were hung on barbed wire, wrapped around fence posts, or clipped to the edges of ration boxes. One nurse said she dried her undergarments by laying them flat on the side of a sandbag wall and hoping the sun would cooperate. They often didn't dry fully before nightfall. Damp fabric wasn't comfortable, but it was better than the alternative. Wind sometimes carried the garments away. Mud splashed back onto them. Stray dogs ran off with them. These incidents weren't funny at the time, but later, women retold the stories as part of their private vocabulary of indignities. If your only clean pair of underwear blew off into the mud, you laughed or cried. Then you picked it up, rinsed it off again, and hoped no one had seen. Some stopped washing altogether. They wore the same pair day after day. When the fabric stiffened, they turned it inside out. When it began to smell, they sprinkled it with ash and kept going. They had no choice. Time was limited. Water was limited. Dignity had already been rationed out weeks earlier. It's almost endearing how people now debate the right cycle for washing delicates, while these women scrubbed with fire ash and bodily waste. No care labels, no fabric softener, just need and grit, and whatever was closest to clean. For women on the move, like messengers and support staff near the front lines, underwear had to be rinsed quickly and packed still damp. There was no time to wait for drying. Some wrapped the wet fabric in towels or newspapers. Others simply wore it damp, hoping their body heat would do the job. It didn't. Dampness led to rashes. Rashes led to infection. And yet they kept doing it. Those stationed in camps learned to share. Undergarments, once personal, became communal in emergencies. A clean pair meant one less thing to worry about. A dirty pair was still better than none. Some marked their initials on the waistbands with charcoal. Others tied a knot in one corner to recognise it later. There was shame in this, but it was quiet. No one spoke it aloud. They nodded when they handed over a garment. They said thank you, or they said nothing. These moments passed quickly. Everyone understood. Everyone needed the same things. I think what strikes me most is that even when these women had nothing, they still tried to clean what couldn't be seen. They weren't performing hygiene for others. They were doing it for themselves because it gave them a sliver of control, because it was something they could still manage in a world that had taken everything else. The fabric wore thin. Holes formed. Stitching came undone. Some were mended with thick thread. Others overlapped layers and pinned them together. Safety pins were valuable. A single one could hold a waistband in place for another week. Buttons were repurposed from old shirts. Elastic was replaced with strips of torn bandages. When garments could no longer be saved, they were burned. Not thrown out. Burned. To remove the lice, the smell, and the shame. Watching underwear curl and blacken in the flames became a strange kind of relief. A small ending in a war filled with things that never ended. Most of these undergarments were made by hand, from donated fabric, from old sheets, from whatever could be sewn into something absorbent and wearable. Women didn't talk about them. There were no photos, no museum pieces, but they existed. They carried sweat, blood, ash, and memory. And they did their job. In the next part, we'll look at what happened when even underwear wasn't enough, when women had no toilet paper, no running water, and had to use leaves, cloth scraps, or whatever they could find just to stay halfway clean. Even when undergarments were washed with ash and dried over barbed wire, the act of staying clean didn't stop there. For women during World War I, one of the most basic needs became one of the most difficult to manage using the toilet. Not just the act itself, but what came after. There was no toilet paper, not in hospitals, not near the trenches, not even in the homes that still had standing walls. It was a luxury, not a supply. Most women had never even expected it to be available. They prepared for something much rougher. Rags became the answer, not the tidy, folded kind. These were scraps cut from old clothes, torn sleeves, or worn-out aprons. Some were pieces of undergarments that had already outlived their original purpose. Others were cut from anything soft enough to wipe and thick enough to survive a second use. The rags didn't match. They weren't sewn. They weren't pretty, but they were there. Each woman had her small system, a cloth pouch, a tin container, an old food can. Something to store the used rags until they could be rinsed. They weren't thrown away. They couldn't be. Water was limited, fabric was limited, and modesty didn't outweigh necessity. The rags were rinsed when time allowed, then soaked, then dried, and then folded again for the next use. The smell was part of it. No matter how well a woman tried to rinse the fabric, some odour stayed. So she carried the pouch tucked into a bag or a corner of her cot, wrapped in another cloth to keep it from being obvious. It didn't stop the odour completely, but it helped. There were no perfumes, no chemicals, just sweat, old cotton, and habit. One nurse joked that the only thing worse than using the rag was realising you forgot where you last put it. That joke never had a punchline. It just made others nod and keep working. Everyone had the same struggle. Not every woman had cloth. Some relied on whatever nature offered. Leaves were common when near woods or open fields. Not chosen for comfort, but for thickness. Thin leaves tore too easily. Thorns were obvious hazards. Some learned through trial and error. One leaf meant a mild rash. Another meant a night of burning pain. Still, they kept using them. The grass was too flimsy. The bark was too rough. But moss was favoured when available. It was soft, absorbent, and easy to discard. But moss didn't grow everywhere, and it didn't stay clean long. If it was wet or covered in bugs, it was useless. So women stored it carefully, in boxes or wrapped in dry cloth, and kept it close like a secret weapon. In camps or hospitals, leaves weren't always available. So women went back to fabric. A sleeve cut off an old shirt, the edge of a headscarf, even strips from socks that had lost their pairs. When fabric grew too worn, it frayed. Strands clung to skin. But it was still better than nothing. We panic today when public restrooms run out of toilet paper. But for these women, that was simply normal. They didn't expect convenience. They expected to adapt, and they did. Cleaning the used rags was difficult. Buckets of rinse water had to be carried and emptied. The clothes had to be soaked for hours, then wrung out by hand. If soap was available, it was used. If not, ash or salt water did the job. In some places, they were boiled in cooking pots. In others, they were beaten with stones or scrubbed on wood planks. Each method had its risks. Cloth wore out faster. Skin did too. Rashes and irritation were common. The skin between the thighs, around the backside, and under the underwear stayed sensitive. Reused rags sometimes carried bacteria. Women bled, itched, and kept going. No one stopped because of discomfort. They simply changed the cloth, wiped slower, or used a cleaner corner. Some women stitched tiny marks onto the edges of their rags. A red thread for used once, a blue one for washed but damp. It wasn't necessary, but it helped keep track. Others didn't bother. They folded the cloth, wrapped it in another, and forgot it until the next time. Privacy was limited. In many shelters, there was no proper toilet, just a trench, a corner behind a building. A hole was dug into the ground. Women went in pairs, one standing watch while the other squatted. They didn't talk. They didn't look. They waited, switched places, and walked back without a word. I think what strikes me most is how this all became normal. Not because it was acceptable, but because there was no alternative. They learned to manage. They taught each other. Older women shared tips about leaves, cloth folds, and how to scrub out stains using only ash and pressure. Young girls listened and copied. The clothes dried near fires or behind crates, sometimes near the stove, other times on ropes tied across beds. They fluttered like flags. each one holding the story of someone trying to keep a small part of herself clean. They were rarely spoken of, never shown, and always needed. When cloth ran out entirely, women went without. Some wiped with bare hands, then cleaned them with dirt or cold water. Others waited, or avoided food to delay the need. It didn't work for long. Their bodies didn't follow ration schedules. Every night, they checked their little pouch. Was there a clean cloth? Was the last one dry? Did they have time to rinse the rest tomorrow? These were the questions no one asked aloud, but everyone thought them. It's hard not to admire the discipline it took to keep going, knowing even your most private needs had to be managed with someone else's old shirt. There was no embarrassment, only routine: wipe, fold, rinse, hang, repeat. And when it all became too much, when the clothes wore out or disappeared, they started over, found another strip, picked another leaf, cut another square from something that used to be warm, soft, and theirs. In the next part, we'll follow what happened when women had no safe place to relieve themselves, how they squatted in trenches, shared latrines with men, and learned to go without shame, even when the sky was open and the ground was freezing. After wiping themselves with rags and drying them over barbed wire, many women still tried to hold on to something more than just basic hygiene. They tried to feel like themselves. It wasn't about beauty in the usual sense. It was about familiarity, a routine, a reminder of a life before the war. That's why, despite the dirt, the blood, the lice, and the freezing nights, some women still attempted to apply a bit of makeup, even if they had to make it from whatever they could find. There was no cosmetics bag, no mirror on the wall, no compact tucked into a uniform pocket. These women didn't carry lipsticks or powders from home. They made them, slowly, carefully, quietly, 1 teaspoon at a time. They knew the ingredients weren't safe. They knew the results wouldn't last. But it gave them a moment of control in a world where everything else had been taken. Lip colour came first. Red was the only option. Bright colours were impossible to create without chemicals. Red, however, was available in the most unlikely form: dried blood. Animal blood, often saved from the kitchen or collected after butchering, was dried on cloth, then scraped off and crushed into a powder. Mixed with animal fat or grease, it formed a thick, dark paste. That paste was smeared onto lips using fingers, cloth, or the edge of a spoon. It didn't glide on smoothly, it didn't smell pleasant, but it worked. The colour stayed for a while, especially in the cold. It gave pale faces a bit of life, and it made the person wearing it feel something familiar, something almost human. One nurse said it made her feel like she had a face again, not just skin holding in exhaustion. No one complimented it. No one laughed at it. They just nodded in understanding. It wasn't vanity. It was survival of a different kind. Some women used red wine residue or beetroot when blood wasn't available. Beetroot was rarely fresh, but the peel, when dried and rubbed, left a faint stain. A few rubbed rose petals on their lips, but they wilted too fast. Fat from bacon grease or soup was used as a base when nothing else could be found. It smelled, but it softened the colour and helped it stay on longer. Face powder was even harder to make. There was no talcum, no commercial powder of any kind. So women used flour, not baking flour meant for pastries, but whatever dusty ingredient they could steal from a storeroom: wheat flour, potato starch, even powdered biscuit crumbs. It was dabbed onto the face using a cloth or the corner of a napkin. It didn't hide the dirt, but it reduced the shine. That was enough. For some, ashes became powder, fine, cool, and grey. They were rubbed lightly across the cheeks and forehead. It wasn't pleasant. It smelled of fire and smoke, but it gave the illusion of a dry, rested face. Some women believed it helped reduce irritation. Others did it purely out of habit. In rare cases, women experimented with crushed mushrooms. Powder from dried mushroom caps, especially pale varieties, was sifted and stored in small tins. It clung poorly to the skin, but it gave a matte look that felt deliberate. No one knew whether it was safe. They used it anyway. It's strange how people today worry about expired concealer, while these women applied fungus powder and fat to their lips and cheeks without blinking. They didn't do it for others. Most men never noticed. They often didn't recognise that the woman across from them had even bothered. That wasn't the point. These acts were private, quiet, sometimes done early in the morning before anyone else woke, sometimes at night, using a reflection in a dented spoon. They weren't done with hope, just with discipline. The same powder might last for weeks, stored in a handkerchief or folded into the corner of a scarf. Women touched their faces only lightly, patting with care. Too much movement would undo it. Too much rubbing would smear the fat. But that wasn't a problem. They didn't expect it to last all day, just long enough to sit up, feel normal, and get dressed. I think these moments say more about strength than any battlefield medal. The effort to find a red pigment in a war zone speaks to a kind of internal resistance. They weren't fighting for beauty. They were fighting for memory, for identity, for something that was theirs. Of course, not everyone joined in. Many didn't have the supplies or the time. Some saw it as foolish. Others were too tired. But those who did it didn't judge. They understood. And sometimes, when one woman shared her red grease or mushroom powder, it became a quiet ritual between them. There were no brushes, no applicators, no mirrors, just fingers, just trust. Some smeared the red across their cheeks when lipstick was too much. Others dabbed it under their eyes to look less hollow. A few even painted colour onto fingernails using beet juice or ink from fountain pens. Ink was a dangerous choice. It stained for days and didn't wash out. But for those who still wanted the sharp contrast of colour, it offered one of the few intense options left. It wasn't about matching outfits. No one had more than one uniform. It was about impact. One mark, one line, one trace of choice. Even the act of applying the mixture brought comfort. The smell of grease, the feel of powder on the fingertips, the rhythm of smoothing it across the skin. It didn't matter how dirty their faces were. The ritual still offered something. Some women laughed at themselves as they did it. Others stayed serious. There was no correct mood, just the fact that they kept doing it, even when bombs fell, even when the powder was made from ash, even when no one would see them except a wounded man half conscious on a stretcher. Maybe that's why these efforts mattered, because they were done when everything else had broken down. It wasn't about reclaiming beauty. It was about remembering that the war hadn't taken everything. When the powders ran out and the grease spoiled, they stopped, quietly, without announcement. But sometimes, when new women arrived, someone would share the recipe again, just in case she needed it. In the next part, we'll see how having no private toilets forced women to relieve themselves out in the open, in trenches or behind sheets, with others watching nearby, and how modesty adjusted when there simply wasn't time to care. Even after women learned to wipe themselves with moss and save lipstick in matchboxes, they still had to face one reality every single day. There was nowhere to go to the toilet in private. In most places during World War I, there were no bathrooms, no stalls, and no doors to close. There was only the ground, a shovel, and whatever space you could claim between meals, air raids, and duties. For many women, relieving themselves meant squatting over a hole dug in the dirt and hoping no one was watching. The latrines were basic. A trench was dug into the mud, sometimes surrounded by sandbags, sometimes not. There were no doors, no screens, no distance between users. Men and women shared these spaces, though no one liked to talk about that. The rule was simple: turn your head and pretend not to notice. That was the closest thing to privacy anyone had. In some camps, there were wooden planks laid across the top of the trench with round cutouts. If the wood broke, people just squatted near the edge. If it rained, the entire area became slick with mud and waste, and yet it was still the only option. There were no alternate places to go, no bushes far enough away, No time to find one, even if there had been. Women didn't wait until it was convenient. They couldn't. When the need came, they grabbed their coat, walked toward the latrine, and hoped the others would give them space. Some went in pairs. One stood facing outward, creating a physical barrier, while the other squatted quickly behind her. They switched places silently. This was not a moment for conversation, just another part of the day. One woman described it as squatting beside shame and trying not to fall in. There were no laughs, no eye contact. Everyone did their best to forget what they'd seen 5 minutes earlier. There were no toilet seats, no flush handles, no buckets of clean water. The smell was constant. It clung to clothing and hair. The flies were worse. They landed on open skin, on food bowls, on hands not yet washed. Soap was rarely available near the latrine. Water even less so. Most people wiped their hands on their trousers or aprons and moved on. Women didn't have access to female-specific spaces. There were no divisions made for them. The latrines were built for soldiers, quickly, roughly, and without consideration for who might come later. The height, the spacing, the approach, even the angle of the boards favoured men. For women, squatting meant fully undressing from the waist down, often while trying not to drag fabric in the mud. If their uniforms touched the ground, they stayed wet all day. Many women avoided drinking water when they could. They hoped it would delay the stage to go. It didn't work for long. The body kept working and eventually the urge returned. Some women held it too long and suffered the consequences. Urinary tract infections became common. Painful urination. Lower abdominal cramps. Backaches. But there were no pills. No treatment beyond resting and hoping. We panic today over shared public restrooms. But these women relieved themselves in open trenches with no doors and no toilet paper. They didn't flinch. They adapted. They stood guard for one another and moved fast. There were times when the trench itself wasn't even dug. In forward areas, soldiers and support staff dug a small hole behind their post, used it, and covered it with dirt. Women did the same. They carried a small trowel or stick, sometimes just a boot heel, to dig a shallow space. The goal was to be quick and leave no trace. In mud or snow, it was harder. At night, the risk increased. There were no lights, just darkness and instinct. Women tripped over logs, stumbled into others, and sometimes found themselves in the wrong spot entirely. Some carried candles, others moved by feel. If a latrine wasn't nearby, they went behind tents, beside barrels, or near fences. It wasn't safer, just quieter. Some built small covers using crates or hung blankets from rope to create partitions. These weren't official structures. They blew away in the wind or got stolen for firewood, but for a few hours they offered something that felt like a door. I think what stayed with them most wasn't the lack of privacy, but the fact that they had to accept it. They stopped reacting. They stopped apologising. They adjusted to a world where being seen during something private was no longer unusual. The latrines overflowed during storms. The pits flooded. Waste rose to the surface. People still had to use them. They stood on rocks or planks. If the boards were missing, they squatted over the edge and hoped not to fall. A slip could mean infection. A fall could mean injury. But they didn't stop. In winter, the waste froze. In summer, it festered. Either way, the result was the same people kept going. Women pinched their coats between their knees, balanced with their arms out, and made do. There was no alternative. If a woman hesitated, someone else came behind her. There was no line, no waiting room, just urgency. Some women relieved themselves in buckets inside tents during storms. These buckets were shared, emptied once a day, and rinsed if water was available. If not, they were used again. The smell inside the tent grew strong, but it was still better than slipping in mud outside. There was no dignity left in the act, but there was still discipline. They cleaned themselves with rags or scraps of cloth, folded them away, and walked back like nothing had happened. The entire process might take under 5 minutes. Then it was over. It's a strange thing to imagine now, crouching beside strangers in a muddy trench just to urinate, hoping your boots don't sink into someone else's mess. But that was daily life, and it wasn't even considered the hardest part. These women didn't demand changes. They didn't wait for better facilities. They made their routines inside a world that didn't offer comfort. It wasn't a rebellion, it was survival. They used what was there, took turns, and kept going. In the next part, we'll step away from the trenches and into the makeshift dressing areas, where women stripped under blankets, wiped themselves with cold cloths, and tried to change their underwear without ever exposing their skin to the room around them. After learning to relieve themselves in trenches and wipe with rags, women during World War I still had one habit they tried to maintain every day: washing their faces. Not because it was expected, not because they cared how they looked, but it helped them feel awake. It was one of the few gestures of normalcy they could still hold on to. A wet cloth across the forehead meant they were starting the day. But even that became difficult when clean water ran out. Water wasn't free. It wasn't always safe. It didn't come out of taps or arrive in neat bottles. Most of the time, it had to be fetched from wells, drawn from shared buckets, or gathered during rain. If the well was dry or too far away, women had to use what was nearby. That often meant stagnant water, water that had been sitting for days, water with leaves floating on top or bugs swimming just below the surface. They scooped it anyway. The best source of water was rain, but when it didn't come, they turned to whatever remained. Water that had collected in broken gutters, pools near collapsed buildings, muddy ditches, bomb craters. These holes, left by explosives, are often filled with rain and runoff. They were wide, shallow, and filled with debris, but they held water, and water was what they needed. They used metal cups, small pots, even their helmets to scoop out what they could. The water was always cold, often murky. It smelled like soil, ash, or something worse. But they dipped their cloths into it and wiped their faces one section at a time. Forehead, cheeks, neck. If the cloth got too dirty, they rinsed it in the same water and kept going. One woman said her morning routine included checking for dead insects in the cup before she used it. That was the new definition of hygiene. Not clean, just manageable. Some found water in livestock troughs, shared by cows, horses, or even dogs. These long wooden basins often sat near barns or shelters. The surface was slimy. Algae grew along the edges. But beneath the layer of scum, the water still seemed usable. Women took the cleanest section they could find and ignored the rest. They didn't ask what had been in it. They didn't want to know. Skin reacted badly to this water. Red patches formed along the jawline. Pimples grew under the chin. Some women broke out in small sores. Others developed dry, itchy skin that peeled in flakes. There was no lotion to fix it. They simply stopped touching the area and hoped it would go away. Some women tied cloth around their faces to protect their skin from wind, dirt, and further irritation. It's hard not to laugh at today's obsession with facial serums when these women wiped crater water across their cheeks and called it good enough. They didn't think in terms of skin care. They thought in terms of staying alert, avoiding infection, and removing just enough grime to keep moving. Sometimes the water wasn't even theirs. In field hospitals, soldiers were washed first. The leftover water was saved for wiping equipment or mopping floors. Women used the same cloth, dipped in the same water, to wipe their faces at the end of the day. The water was dark by then, full of soap residue, blood traces, and disinfectant. Still, it cooled the skin. That was enough. Cloth was reused constantly. A single square might serve for wiping hands, cleaning wounds, and dabbing the forehead. Women kept one corner cleaner than the others. They folded carefully. They labelled parts mentally. One edge for the eyes, one for the nose. The dirtiest end stayed away from the face. Washing didn't remove the smell. It didn't make them feel fresh. It just signalled a moment of pause, a short step back from the rest of the day, a few seconds to focus on something simple. Dip, wipe, fold, repeat. What I notice again and again is how they kept routines alive even when nothing around them supported it. The water was dirty, the cloth was old, the space was crowded. But they still sat down, opened their kit, and wiped their face with care. Women who had access to fire tried to heat their water. Warm water felt better on the skin. It loosened dirt and reduced the sting of cold mornings. But firewood was rare. Most saved it for cooking. A warm wash was a rare treat, often remembered long after it was over. Some women boiled their water to kill the bacteria, but this was time-consuming and often impractical. Most didn't bother. They took their chances. If their skin reacted badly, they let it heal on its own. There were no ointments, no treatments, only rest, which was also in short supply. In some places, women filtered their water using cloth. They poured it slowly through a folded towel, hoping to remove at least some of the dirt and insects. It worked to a degree. The water looked clearer, but it still smelled the same. They used it anyway. Face washing usually happened in silence. There was no chatting, no joking. Just quiet motions and a focus on not spilling what little they had. Some women knelt, others crouched, a few sat on crates or overturned pots, their backs hunched, their hands moved slowly. They didn't look around. Cloth, once used, was wrung out and hung to dry. It didn't always dry fully before being needed again. Some wiped their face with a cloth that was still damp from the day before. Others folded it up and tucked it under their shirt to keep it warm for the next use. There were no mirrors, no way to check what they looked like after washing. They didn't need to. They knew they looked tired. They knew the dirt never fully disappeared. But they kept doing it. In a way. I think that morning wipe meant more than any bath could have. It said, I'm still here. I'm still trying. They didn't need anyone to notice. They just needed to do it for themselves. The crater water dried on their skin, left behind a thin film, tightness around the nose, flakes on the forehead. Still, it was better than nothing, and sometimes better than waiting for water that never came. In the next part, we'll go deeper into what they wore on their feet, and how going for weeks without clean socks or dry shoes led to infections, rotting nails, and feet that barely fit into their boots. After wiping their faces with crater water and folding damp cloths back into their aprons, many women had to face one of the most physically exhausting and overlooked hygiene problems of all their feet. While the rest of the body could be ignored, or even tolerated, the feet rarely gave that option. They carried the full weight of war, standing, walking, running, and waiting. And all of that happened inside the same pair of socks and the same pair of boots, often for weeks at a time. Women didn't have extra socks. They barely had enough undergarments. Most of them wore the same pair for days, sometimes longer. These socks soaked up sweat, absorbed mud, and collected grit from the inside of their boots. They became heavy, rough, and stiff. Taking them off was hard. Putting them back on was worse. Sometimes the fabric peeled away with skin. Boots were issued for function, not comfort. They weren't sized for women. Most were hand-me-downs from male soldiers or repurposed stock that had no proper lining. The boots rubbed against ankles, pinched toes, and pressed on heels until the skin broke. Wet socks only made it worse. The moisture softened the skin, making it easier to tear, and once the skin opened, infection often followed. Most women didn't notice right away. There was too much else happening, but after a few days, the signs became clear. The itching between the toes, the peeling skin along the ball of the foot, the soreness under the nails, the sharp sting each time the boots were removed and the air touched the raw spots. One woman said she could smell her own feet through her boots after 3 days of walking in soaked wool. There was no fix. She just kept walking. Drying the socks was difficult. Some women removed them at night and placed them near the fire. Others hung them inside their coat to use body heat. If it rained, everything stayed wet. If it snowed, they froze. A frozen sock didn't bend, it cracked. Women tried to soften them with their hands or warm breath, but it only helped for a few seconds. When socks were too wet to wear, women lined their boots with paper, letters, newspapers, or even torn food wrappers were folded and placed flat at the bottom of the boot. This created a barrier between the foot and the leather. It wasn't comfortable, it didn't absorb much, but it gave the illusion of dryness. Some added dry grass, hay, or fabric scraps to fill in space. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was to keep walking. It's oddly impressive how a woman could line her boots with crumpled propaganda leaflets and still hike through trenches like nothing was wrong. The feet didn't get a break. Neither did the rest of her. Toenails suffered. They grew soft, bent inward, or thickened painfully. Some fell off. Others turned dark. The pressure from the boot, combined with moisture and friction, caused bruising under the nail bed. Women wrapped their toes in scraps of gauze or cloth, not for healing, but to cushion the pain. The boots didn't accommodate bandages, so the pressure continued. In extreme cases, women developed trench foot. This condition, caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions, made the skin swell and turn pale. It looked spongy and cold. In advanced stages, the skin darkened, blisters formed, the foot went numb, and if untreated, the tissue started to die. There were no medics for this, no foot inspections. Women self-treated. They dried their feet when they could, changed socks when available, and elevated their legs during rare breaks. But most of the time, they just tightened the laces and walked on. I think what stays with me is the thought of someone walking on a numb foot with a missing toenail, holding a tray of supplies, if it didn't hurt. They didn't show it. They didn't say anything. They just kept going. When they did take off their boots, the smell filled the room. It wasn't just sweat. It was fungus, blood, rot. Some women wiped their feet with vinegar if they had it. Others tried ash or salt, but these burned the open wounds. They wrapped their feet in cloth and tied it tight with a string. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it made things worse. Clean socks were traded like currency. A dry pair was more valuable than soap or powder. Women shared when they could. A clean pair might be offered to someone who had to walk further the next day, or given to someone with an open blister. The exchange was quiet. There was no boasting, just a folded pair passed hand to hand. Boots eventually gave out. The soles separated. The leather cracked. The laces snapped. Women patched them with twine or stitched canvas over the holes. Others wrapped them with strips of fabric, tying them tightly like sandals. Some tried stuffing the holes with straw or cloth. It didn't hold for long. And yet, they still moved. They still showed up. They still carried what needed to be carried, even with feet that were bleeding, blistered or numb. There was no time to sit and soak, no chance to rest and elevate. The body kept going because the war kept going. The pain was ignored, compartmentalized, folded away like a pair of crusted socks. Most women didn't get to wash their feet with soap. They wiped them with cold water. If that, they rubbed them with a cloth. They tried not to cry out when the sock peeled off the skin. They didn't expect comfort. They expected a function. When the war ended, some women still had nerve damage. Their toenails never grew back correctly. Their arches flattened. Their toes bent inward from months of pressure. But few complained. They considered themselves lucky. Others had lost feet entirely. The routine stayed remove sock, dry foot, line boot, pull laces, walk forward. It didn't matter if it hurt. It had to be done. In the next part, we'll see how these same women dealt with body hair with no razors, no soap, and no privacy. Some found painful and creative ways to remove it, while others simply gave up and let it grow wild under their damp, itchy uniforms. Once women figured out how to manage their feet in damp boots and mouldy socks, there was still one more layer of discomfort they couldn't avoid. Body hair. It wasn't something anyone had time to think about at first, but after weeks without a bath, months without privacy, and years without reliable tools, it became something else entirely. Not a grooming task, but a nuisance, an itch, a weight, something they either dealt with painfully or stopped trying to deal with at all. There were no razors handed out, no packs of fresh blades, no creams, no soap, no scissors small enough to use with precision. Most of the women had nothing. If they wanted to remove hair, they had to improvise, and improvising usually meant choosing between pain, risk, or just letting it grow. Some women used fire, a match, a candle, a piece of metal heated over a stove or lantern. They waved the flame close to the skin, never touching it directly. The goal was to singe the hair, not burn the flesh. But it wasn't exact. The line between too close and not close enough was razor thin. Hair caught quickly. The smell was sharp, acrid, and the skin turned pink even without touching the flame. They did this in corners, behind blankets, near open windows. It was quick. It had to be. One woman held the flame. The other directed it. They worked fast before the wax dripped. The wind shifted, or someone walked in. It didn't get rid of all the hair, just enough to stop the worst of the itching under fabric. Others used blades, not new ones, not clean ones, just whatever they could find. Rusted razors passed between bunkmates. Small knives are used for cutting vegetables or cleaning nails. Broken safety razors without handles. They weren't safe. They weren't sharp. But with slow pressure, they cut through hair in patches. Skin bled easily. Infection was common. One woman said she shaved her armpits with a sewing needle because it was the only metal she trusted not to break off. The result was uneven, painful, and temporary. But it was something. There was no shaving cream, no soap, just water, if they had it, and the hope that the blade wouldn't slip. Some used ash mixed with water as a paste. Others used animal fat to help the blade slide. Both methods left the skin raw, red lines across the thighs, small cuts under the arms, a burning sensation that lingered for hours. They didn't do it often. There wasn't time. There wasn't privacy. And honestly, after a while, it stopped feeling important. Most women gave up. They let the hair grow, thick under the arms, heavy around the legs, a soft shield beneath the uniform. It wasn't a statement. It was survival. One less thing to worry about, one less injury to manage. It's funny how modern beauty ads still talk about smoothness like it's an accomplishment, while these women saw body hair as insulation, something to keep the skin from rubbing against the wool, something to protect the open sores. Hair held odour. That was true, but so did everything else. No one could tell if the smell came from the boots, the undershirt, or the thighs. Everyone smelled, everyone sweats, and most people had stopped noticing. In some places, women tried to pluck, with their fingers, with tweezers meant for bandages, with needles, slowly, one at a time. It took hours. It hurt. And it came back. After a few attempts, they stopped. Some rubbed the hair with a cloth in one direction, hoping friction would pull it loose. Others used sand or salt, thinking it would thin the growth. It didn't. All it did was irritate the skin. I think what mattered most to them was that body hair stopped being a distraction. It became just another layer of the war. It grew, it itched, it stayed, and then it stopped mattering. No one commented on it. No one compared notes. They didn't ask how the other managed. They didn't laugh about it or complain. It wasn't something worth sharing. It was just another task that got pushed aside. Some women hated it. Those who remembered shaving regularly before the war and missed the clean feel. But they didn't say it out loud. Not when others were wrapping bleeding feet, scrubbing underwear with ash, or wiping their faces with water scooped from a ditch. The ones who tried to remove it did so in silence, and usually in secret. A quiet 5 minutes alone with a candle or a blunt blade. That was it. The uniforms didn't help. Thick fabric rubbed against thighs, underarms and shoulders. The hair underneath only made the pressure worse. Sweat clung to it. Dirt collected in it. But it also cushioned the friction, protected broken skin. It was uncomfortable, but it was useful. No one wrote about this in letters. No one asked families back home to send razors. If someone did receive one, they kept it quiet. It became a personal item, carefully guarded, wrapped in cloth, hidden in a pouch. Even if they had something sharp, the rust built up fast. Blades oxidized in the damp air. They dulled within days. Skin grew tougher in response. Cuts became shallower. Healing took longer. Most accepted it. Hair was no longer a beauty concern. It was a skin issue, a hygiene issue, something they monitored only if it caused pain. They didn't let the discomfort break them. They adjusted, ignored it, or dealt with it in the simplest way possible. Then they moved on. It wasn't worth pausing over. In some places, commanders eventually stopped expecting female staff to groom themselves. There were no inspections, no reprimands. They saw the same sweat, the same dirt, the same signs of fatigue. The rules faded like the polish on their boots. When the war ended, many women kept the habit. They didn't rush to remove what had grown. They had learned to live with it. It didn't mean anything anymore. It was just there. In the next part, we'll look at how women manage their body odour, especially when there was no deodorant, no clean water, and the same uniform had been worn for weeks without a